Well, President Alberto Pera, ladies and gentlemen and friends, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be invited to participate today in the conference of the Association. When people talk about the development of European competition policy, they emphasize the long Anglo-Saxon traditions and the German traditions. But I'd like to say here to you in the Association that the antitrust community of Italy has made a substantial contribution to the development both of national but also of European competition policy. That's reflected in the active debates which the Italian community has participated in at European level, but also in the strong enforcement record of the Autorità and of the major interest which national courts in Italy have taken in the development of legal concepts of competition law. I apologize to you for not talking in Italian. I've worked for and worked with many eminent compatriots of yours, but unfortunately several other European languages have dominated my career. I'd also like to say before I start that I think your president was a little bit over-optimistic. He certainly has banned the coffee breaks, but he's probably banned lunch as well. So and I'll try and be as short as possible. Before I address the specific issue of the interaction between competition and industrial policy, I want to underline the extent to which the economic and political environment in which competition law is enforced and applied has changed. This is certainly the case in the last 10 years, if not longer. Before the 2007-2009 financial crisis, it would be fair to say that there was a general transatlantic and European consensus that effectively functioning and competitive markets were the best, or at least the least worst instrument to deliver the goods and services that consumers need and want. At the same time, it was accepted that rules were needed to ensure free and fair competition, to ensure that businesses competed on a level playing field, and that consumers were not exploited or ripped off by a powerful combination of firms acting together. It was on the back of that consensus that we saw the development of both the ECN and the ICN together, and the work of the OECD. Competition law was regarded as the most appropriate way of intervening in markets in a way which was the least intrusive. Cartels were rightly regarded as undermining competition and benefiting producers. They were and still are regarded as per se anti-competitive and subject to the most severe sanctions. Mergers could harm competition by strengthening market power of some firms or leading to the acquisition of market power. Mergers therefore had to be vetted ex ante because it was very difficult to unscramble mergers which were already promulgated. As far as other agreements between companies as well as unilateral conduct was concerned, there was nevertheless a general acceptance that they should be looked at case by case without any presumption that they were anti-competitive, but with a need for close scrutiny. In parallel, it was recognized that governments could distort markets by favoring some firms with respect to others through subsidy or legislation. Within the EU, state aid disciplines try to deal with this problem. Outside the EU, there are, of course, WTO anti-subsidy provisions, even if they are more time-consuming and more difficult to implement. Now, the consensus on the benefits of competition and free, often self-correcting markets was accompanied by strong skepticism about traditional industrial policy. Government intervention in markets to create national champions and pick winners in order to preserve local jobs was generally derided as ineffective and wasteful. The most that could be done was to create a favorable regulatory environment for innovation and enterprise. Today's world is somewhat different. In the first place, I think it is fair to say that the concept of an industrial policy has been rehabilitated. Marina Mazzucato has eloquently demonstrated, without tipping into any kind of protectionism, how the economies of countries as so-called neoliberal as the United States base their success as much on interventionist public policies as on private enterprise, in particular where new technologies which are developed for military purposes can be put to use in the wider economy. She has pointed to the benefits of, I quote, transformative public action to promote innovation and industrial change. Professor Mario Pianta has also set out the case for an active industrial policy at national and European level. Such a policy should necessarily include strong action to correct market failures, such as those related to climate change, and help build the capabilities for industrial development through support to infrastructure investments, research and innovation, as well as education and training. But it should also help ensure that domestic firms benefit from a framework of fiscal, regulatory, and public procurement rules that enable them to have the strength and protection to compete internationally. In globalized, high-tech, winner-takes-all markets, especially expecting the free market to provide all the incentives for success is, in his view, not enough. The state has a role to play. The extent to which this intervention is compatible with state aid rules can be debated. A first reading of any text on EU state aid disciplines always starts with the general treaty ban on state aids, except under certain conditions. Yet if you look more closely at the conditions for state aids to be compatible, there is wide scope for an active industrial policy, especially if some categories of aid fall under the general block exemption regulation. If, however, an aid needs to be notified to the Commission, there is an inevitable delay necessary before it can be approved, which can be a disadvantage where swift action is needed. Block exemptions should therefore be applied wherever possible. But secondly, in terms of change of climate, let's recognize that confidence in the ability of markets to produce the right outcomes has been significantly undermined, in particular by the financial crisis itself, but also because markets are increasingly globalized. Globalization has resulted in unequal outcomes in many of our societies. Whether you are a gilet jaune in France, a coal miner in West Virginia, or a steel worker in the north of England, you generally believe free and competitive markets have dealt you a bad hand. And people increasingly expect governments to protect them from firms which they perceive as exploiting them, either by hiking prices or lowering quality and restricting choice, or, for example, by using their personal data for financial gain without their knowing it. Politicians and governments have not been insensitive to these arguments. In all our countries, they have been more than willing to respond to complaints about, for example, excessive and unfair electricity and petrol prices. They have lambasted competition authorities and sectoral regulators for their lack of action and launched initiatives for more control of retail prices. This may not be altogether populist or irrational. Excessive pricing and exploitation are abuses which competition law enforcement aims to eliminate, But competition law has always had some difficulty in dealing with complaints about excessive pricing. We can certainly bring cartels and abusive dominance cases to an end with cease and desist orders, but authorities search in vain for benchmarks for fixing what people say should be the right or the fair price. At a European level, in the Commission, we struggled for many years with abusive dominance cases on mobile roaming charges and interchange fees. So the adoption of regulation in these two areas was certainly accompanied by a sigh of relief by many competition lawyers and law enforcement. These examples highlight the reality that competition law may not in all circumstances provide the quickest and best solutions to a competition problem. In the first place, pursuing a competition law case can take a long time and frequently longer than the process of passing legislation or regulation. Sectoral regulators can act more quickly, even if perhaps they go in where angels fear to tread. Secondly, a competition case results at most in a remedy in a specific case and sets a precedent, but doesn't always provide a solution that is of market-wide effect. Thirdly, competition problems are rarely isolated from other public policy concerns, such as consumer protection, unfair trade practices, intellectual property protection, and data privacy. Frequently, it makes sense to prepare legislation to deal with these issues, even if in the immediate instance a competition law case may be the right way forward. I've begun with this discussion of issues of the public legitimacy and effectiveness of competition policy, primarily in order to distinguish the current debate about competition and industrial policies from the general and more worrying trend in modern-day politics towards regulating for specific outcomes rather than regulating to control the process of competition. The political concern that competition policy could frustrate the pursuit of industrial policy is not new. In the 1970s and 1980s, there were already voices in Europe calling for a much more flexible application of merger control rules. Very few governments have attempted to block mergers in order to protect jobs. Those who have tried have usually found that it can work in the very short term, but it weakens the longer-term viability of the firms, and the jobs end up being lost anyway. At the same time, there's been increasing concern more widely about the impact of acquisition of domestic firms by foreign and sometimes state-owned companies. These acquisitions can lead to a transfer of the headquarters of firms to locations in other countries, with a consequent dilution of the influence of local policies on the merged firm. They can also result in the relocation of assets, such as R&D facilities and qualified personnel, which are seen as intrinsic to the comparative advantage of an economy internationally. Some direct investment may, in addition, place control of infrastructures or activities which are regarded as critical to national security and the long-term competitiveness of an economy in foreign hands, even into the hands of foreign governments. Electricity and communications networks and nuclear power stations are frequently quoted as examples of strategic or critical assets. Yogurt is not necessarily yet in that category, I think, but it has also been raised in the same context. In response to these concerns, the EU institutions adopted in March this year a new regulation which provides for closer screening of foreign direct investment in relation to national security and public issues, including provision for exchange of information on transactions between member states and the Commission and between themselves. Powers to prevent a transaction or impose conditions on it however, remain in the hands of national governments. And at present, 14 member states have legislation which can be used for that purpose. But I think it's important to emphasize that this additional screening and control implies only that mergers which may have been approved on competition grounds can nevertheless be prohibited or amended on other policy grounds. Article 21(4) of the EU merger regulation leaves some room for this kind of exception in order to take account of issues of national security, media plurality, and financial probity. Member states can raise other policy concerns, but it's within the discretion of the Commission to judge whether they are justified. Certainly, the new regulation on control of foreign direct investment gives member states more explicit legitimacy and legal security in imposing conditions on transactions. However, the current debate on industrial and competition policy focuses on the possibility that a merger which should in principle be prohibited on competition grounds could nevertheless be allowed to go ahead. The main argument advanced in favor of more flexibility at EU and national level within Europe is that European firms need to attain a critical mass and to reap economies of scale in order to compete with large, often state-owned foreign competitors on global markets who represent an immediate threat in terms of potential competition. Competition authorities, according to this line of argument, should also participate anticipate the growing strength and penetration of foreign firms on EU markets. Arguably, this call for greater leniency in merger control is not aimed at introducing non-competition criteria into a merger assessment, but at allowing a government or another politically controlled agency to correct a competition authority's assessment of the impact of a transaction on competition. Furthermore, the implied direction of any correction of the merger assessment would not be to impose further constraints on mergers, such as now proposed in the digital economy to prevent killer acquisitions or protect data privacy, but to free the mergers from constraints which competition authorities would normally impose on them. The current framework for merger control at EU level excludes this. The dominant view at both European and national level in Europe has been that competition on a firm's home market strengthens its capacity to compete abroad. In addition, consolidation is always possible, provided, and this is a crucial element, provided that there is no distortion of competition to the disadvantage of consumers. Allowing governments to wave through otherwise prohibited mergers would expose merger control also to capture by business interests and diminish legal certainty and predictability in all member states. There is admittedly some scope for government intervention of the kind envisaged in the assessment of mergers at national level below the European thresholds, but I would say not much. Under German legislation, the so-called Ministererlaubnis enables the responsible minister to approve mergers on public interest grounds, which have in principle been prohibited on competition grounds. However, during the 45 years since the law was adopted, there have been 22 applications for application of this provision, of which only 9 have been successful, and not all of these are based on a revised assessment of the competitive impact of a merger. Similar provisions exist, at least in principle, in French, UK, and Italian law, but have been used sparingly. There continues, of course, to be a considerable debate about market definition. Sometimes mergers can achieve significant efficiencies in most national markets, but threaten the strength of competition in one national market. If the market is genuinely European-wide or global, an intra-European merger is unlikely to be problematic from a competition point of view. But if markets are defined nationally and arguably narrowly, transactions such as the Volvo-Scania truck merger could be prohibited unless there was a remedy which resolved this specific problem in the market where the overlap of the two firms could not be contested by current or potential competitors. The issue of market definition remains, of course, a live one and can be controversial. Product as well as geographical market definition can crucially determine the outcome of any merger assessment. Some updating of the Commission's 1997 notice on market definition could well be necessary to reflect current and anticipated market structures and conditions. But are there any grounds to justify a major change in the established international consensus that competition, and in particular merger control policy, poses no major constraint on industrial policy or economic growth? The French and German governments seem to think so. In the wake of the Commission's prohibition of the merger of the rail businesses of Siemens and Alstom on the 6th of February, they published on the 19th of February a joint manifesto calling for changes in the EU merger regulation and or to the Commission merger guidelines, which would recognize the need for further consolidation which European companies face from foreign firms which were large and state-owned. They have proposed that mergers which involve foreign state-owned firms should be subject to particular scrutiny. They also argue that the EU needs to develop a more forward-looking and dynamic assessment of competitive pressures in markets where non-European firms are gradually acquiring a global presence. They foresee procedures in which the EU's Council of Ministers could exceptionally approve a merger in the European interest when the Commission has prohibited on competition grounds. More details of these proposals are expected from the two governments in the coming weeks. I have emphasized earlier that there are strong arguments in favor of an active industrial policy at European and national level. Both state aid, control, and competition policy need to take account of the international dimension of markets. A dynamic assessment of competitive pressures in markets is essential. However, this assessment cannot be based on hunch or fantasy. It must be rigorous and realistic. I have myself been witness to many investigations where the parties have told us very clearly the Chinese are coming, the Russians are coming, the Koreans are coming, but in the meantime, who looks after the consumer? So the assessment has to be realistic and rigorous, and it needs to be carried out, in my view, by an administrative authority which is subject to the control of the courts, but free from political interference and independent of business interests. Firms should be able to extract efficiencies from a merger, but in any market where there is a competition problem, because there is no realistic prospect of a viable competitor to the merger entity, then every effort should be made to devise a remedy which will allow the overall transaction to go ahead, but avoid harm to consumers in the specific market concerned. This can be done, for example, by establishment of a joint venture for those markets which are truly global and where there's competition, while in the other areas the companies remain separate. Finally, if firms are faced with unfair and subsidized competition from outside the EU, perhaps the first response should be provided by trade defense mechanisms and WTO anti-subsidy procedures rather than weakening competition law enforcement inside the EU. Thank you very much.